Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gil McGowan, and I have the honor of serving as the elected president of the Alberta Federation of Labour, Alberta's largest worker and union advocacy organization. On behalf of the AFL, I'd like to welcome all of you to the latest installment of our popular Lunch and Learn series. Over the past 12 months, we've brought together experts and activists to discuss a broad range of issues, everything from healthcare and education to labor law and workplace health and safety, from COVID safety in the workplace to the need to diversify the Alberta economy. And we've looked at all of these issues through the lens of what's best for Alberta workers. Today, we are turning our attention to an issue that has been front and center on the minds of many Albertans in the lead up to the upcoming provincial election, and that issue is pensions. But before we dive into that topic, I am going to begin this session, as we do with all of our events, by reading the AFL's land acknowledgement. The Alberta Federation of Labour respectfully acknowledges that we are meeting today from all points across the province, including Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory. Treaty 6 territory is in central Alberta, and it is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Treaty 7 territory is in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, Pekainai, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta, which is a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. This territory has provided a traveling route and home to the Cree, Dene, Inuit, as well as the Métis and many others. We recognize the history of oppression of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples in their traditional land across Canada, and we are committed to doing the ongoing and active work of reconciliation. The Alberta Federation of Labour also recognizes that we are all treaty people with treaty obligations, and we are committed to continue living in accordance with the spirit and intent of peace and friendship as foundational to the treaty relationship. As a labor movement, we will actively work together in solidarity to end oppression and seek justice for all peoples on this land. Okay, so thanks very much. And now we're going to turn our attention to the topic at hand. With a provincial election looming, the UCP has raised more than a few eyebrows, and I would argue some blood pressure as well among many Albertans by suggesting that they would like to take Alberta out of the Canada Pension Plan and create an Alberta Pension Plan. This is after they had already stripped Alberta's big public sector pension plans of their right to choose their own investment managers of their pension plans, a move that was not very well received by any of those pension plans, perhaps especially the teachers. And so the question's in front of us. Is the plan to pull Alberta out of CPP a good one? Is there a problem with pensions and pension coverage in Alberta? And if pulling Alberta out of CPP is a bad idea, what would be a better one? Is the status quo acceptable, or are there other ideas that we should be talking about and considering? To help us address these important questions and others, we are joined today by two amazing guests. First, we have Dr. Lindsay Tedds. Dr. Tedds is a professor in the Department of Economics and the Director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. Professor Tedds is a prolific researcher and author, and she is one of our province's most well-known and respected economists. So welcome, Professor Tedds. We are also joined by Keith Ambachtsheer. Keith is Director Emeritus of the International Centre for Pension Management at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. He is also famous for being one of the founding fathers of the so-called Canadian model of public sector pension plans. Specifically, he helped create the Ontario Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, which has formed a model for other big public sector pension plans in Canada, including our own big public sector pension plans right here in Alberta. So welcome, Keith. Today, I'd like to focus on two big questions. The first is, as I suggested, related to this idea from the UCP about pulling Alberta out of CPP. The question is that a good idea? And if it's not, what better ideas should we be discussing in the area of pensions and retirement security? So I'm going to ask Professor Teds to take the lead on the first question, and I'm going to ask Keith to take the lead on the second. And we're also hoping to have input from the audience. So if you have a question on anything that's said during the course of this webinar, please put your question in the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen under Q&A. Just click there and I will be following along to make sure that we don't miss any of your questions. And I will put them on your behalf to Keith and Lindsay during the course of the discussion. So let's get started with the question, frankly, that's on the minds of so many Albertans right now. Does it make sense to pull Alberta out of the Canada Pension Plan? So maybe, Lindsay, you want to address that question first.
Sure. I mean, in the end, this is a political exercise. This is a political question. It is not, in fact, really an economic question. And the reasons for that is that, I mean, the origins of all of this is that classic firewall letter that was written, I don't know, however long ago. And it's all just about, you know, sticking it to Ottawa, as they say. But what we really have to think about as we're thinking about this as an economic question, we have to think about what it means to the people, not to the politicians, to decide whether or not this is in our best interests. And I've got to say, the risks are way too high in pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan, and the benefits way too low for this to make any economic sense for any person.
So let's talk about some of the risks. You know, we've heard from Premier Smith, we heard from her predecessor, Jason Kenney, that this would be a great idea for Alberta primarily because we have a younger population. And so they say that we could get the same kind of benefits from an Alberta pension plan that we currently get from CPP at a lower cost. So is there any truth to that argument? And if not, are there other things that would be that we could see as drawbacks of, you know, when it comes to pulling Alberta out of CPP?
Yeah, I mean, where some of these numbers come from, like, you know, the Fraser Institute saying that premiums could drop like 40% if we pulled out of the CPP. But this is based off of a very well, not a good calculation. They just look at what are the annual contributions that go into the CPP from Albertans and match that to the annual disbursements. And those disbursements, the payment of benefits is to a whole other different population, right? So they just look how many Albertans contribute in a year, how many Albertans get a pension. And because there's a gap, we should pull out because we're paying too much for it. As far as I know, Albertans are quite mobile, and they are particularly mobile when they retire, which means that those benefits that Albertans paid into that pension plan, they're actually accruing those benefits in another province or, God forbid, another country. And that is actually something that a lot of people don't talk about, is this interprovincial mobility or intercountry mobility. And intercountry mobility actually raises the complication of pulling out of the CPP, because the CPP has agreements with 50 different countries about how to treat the CPP. Alberta would have to renegotiate all of those foreign agreements to make sure that everybody is made whole. So that's one example. Some of the other risks have to do with risk pooling, right? There's a lot of advantages that come from taking an entire country of workers, bringing their assets together and going out as a whole. into the investment community. You have a lot more power, a lot more control, and a better ability to profile risk over a period of time. And if you look at the returns of the Canadian Pension Plan over AIMCO, there's a big difference in returns between those two, with the Canada Pension Plan averaging about 10% a year, which is really good. And I'm envious of that return, to be honest with you. So, you know, those are some of the other, and another one that doesn't get talked about is the administrative costs, right? Alberta is going to have to set up an entire thing. So first of all, it has to signal to Ottawa 3 years before it wants to pull out that it's going to pull out. Within a year after that, it has to have the legislation set up. It has to be comparable. It then has to be reviewed by the federal government, go through GIC approval. And that's the whole process to protect the fact that if you're going to pull out of the CPP, you have to offer a comparable plan. So it's not cheap to set up a whole other administrative structure. And I'm curious about a government that talks about small government wanting to replicate an entire administrative structure that actually works incredibly well.
You know, Lindsay, thanks for that. I just want to put to you some of the arguments in favor of pulling out of CPP that have been bandied around, not just by the Premier, but you know, supporters of the UCP and this idea. So the two things that I hear most often is that, well, Quebec does it, right? So why can't we? And the other argument, which you sort of alluded to, is that this notion that's been repeated over and over again, but frankly, I find very troubling, is that we pay more than we get out, right? Those are the two arguments that I hear most often. If Quebec can do it, why can't we? And we pay more than we get out of it. And I'd like to give both you and Keith an opportunity to respond to those, because I think those are the two arguments that we hear so most often here in Alberta to justify this move.
Okay, I'll start talking about Quebec. Quebec didn't join CPP, right? they opted out in 1966 for the exact same reasons, right? Younger population, and then they started out paying lower benefits. They now pay higher benefits because demographics change. The returns that they've been able to get have been lower. So sure, you can talk about Quebec, and I'm not saying that Alberta can't do this. I'm saying it shouldn't do this, right? So technically it's possible. The conditions are in there for you to pull out, but nobody's done it since the pension has been set up. And so there's a lot of real big unknowns as to what would happen to the existing pool of contributions, how that would go to Alberta, how would they deal with those and invest them? And what do you do with somebody like me, who in most of her employment careers paid in other provinces? And so what happens to my contributions? How does this affect my pension, given that I'm not that far away from retirement? These things matter a lot, depending on the age that you are. Now, in terms of this idea that you can pay lower premiums, again, this is modeling, right? You can make a whole lot of assumptions and make something look really, really attractive, or you can change the assumptions and make it look risky. And the matter of the fact, as it turns out, those little assumptions that you can tweak, minor changes to those assumptions push you into a higher premium than would occur otherwise. And the big ones being here: income, mobility, age, and the demographic profile of our workers, because the Canada Pension Plan is a pay-as-you-go pension, right? So current workers pay for the benefits of those that are retired, although there's been a tweak to that, and that's coming in as we speak now. But it doesn't take much of a change in those assumptions to shift you into higher premiums than you would pay under the Canada Pension Plan. So Keith, I think you'll have some good points here.
So I actually wrote a paper on this 3 years ago, shortly after the Fraser Institute paper came out with this, we can save $3 billion a year story. And so the title of my paper was the APP proposal, what's in it for the people of Alberta? And I came up with three problems. One of them, Lindsay's already discussed, which is, if you like, the risk underwriting problem. A point in time is nothing in a pension arrangement. These are multi-decade arrangements. And just as, Quebec was in a very different demographic situation back in the 60s than it is now, the same thing is likely to be the case in Alberta. I mean, the underlying reality we've got here is, a fossil fuel-based economy that's done very well, continues to do very well. But if you take a 25-year view, it's going to be a very different ballgame. And you have to think about the very different underwriting capacity of these future payments in a very different economy. Diversification makes sense is sort of the number one argument. And the number two that, again, Lindsay's mentioned is the whole transition problem. How do you get from A to B? Hugely complicated for all the reasons that Lindsay's already mentioned, including how do you split up this $500 billion pot we've got? I can see huge arguments about, we should get X%, and then the comeback is, no, it's Y%, and all these things can keep on going for a very long time. What are the benefits going to be of the new Alberta, pension plan? Is it the same as CPP? Is it going to be different? Why? And then the setup costs, which again, Lindsay's been, this is not a cheap thing to do, to go from A to B. There's a lot of startup costs. And then the final area is the whole investment side. And this is from 3 years ago, and that was a person called Daniel Smith talking at the time about the fact that, with all this stuff going on about the environmental thing, somebody's got to support the oil and gas industry. Well, if you start thinking about using retirement savings to support a particular element of the economy, you're heading down a very slippery slope. And so then the comparison I made was the Heritage Fund in Alberta versus the Norwegian, like now call it a global pension fund for Norwegians. Very different approach, where the province spent most of the money and the Norwegians didn't. So you've got a whole bunch of issues wrapped up in this, what sounds like a very simple proposition as to why this is really not a very good idea. So that's sort of my short version of 3 reasons why don't go there.
So we've heard a long list of reasons why this would be reckless and irresponsible. Keith, you just mentioned this notion of using people's retirement savings as sort of a slush fund to prop up industries that might not be as strong 20 years from now as they are now. Right now, that's, I don't think that's what people want their retirement savings used for. And you both talked about the potential for lack of portability. You've talked about the potential unnecessary cost associated with the shift. One thing that and then you've also talked about the demographics, and that while we might have a young population now, that may not always be the case, and Quebec is a cautionary tale in that regard. But one of the things that I hear from our members when we talk about this is just the fear about their own personal retirement security, right? And maybe if one or the both of you could talk about the importance of CPP to individuals as they make that transition from work to retirement. Because I mean, honestly, I'd like to say that everyone has a workplace pension to supplement CPP, but they don't. So can you talk about that a little bit, about what they're gambling with and how important it is?
Well, it's very important. I think we're now down to less than 30% of workers being covered by pensions, and the majority are in the public sector. Yeah. And so, this is a concern for me as I think about public policy and retirement. Is that if we get to retirement and we don't have the appropriate amount of our own retirement savings set up, the backstop is GIS and OAS, right? It's taxpayers funding through those programs, which really don't give you, well, at least GIS, it's poverty level. It just barely gets you out of poverty. And there's a reason why seniors' poverty rates in Canada have dropped from 25% to 3%. And that is because of this robust social infrastructure that we have put in. And CPP is a very, very important one to workers because it's portable, right? It's not attached to an employer. Anywhere I go in Canada, it's there. We have a defined benefit floor to it, and then your contributions raise you up to a maximum. Again, this works with GIS, OAS, CPP, your private retirement savings. All of these come together to lead to this outcome that seniors in Canada, while we still have pockets of problems for them, we have made a dramatic impact on poverty rates amongst seniors. So it's a guaranteed base, right, for workers. Again, it's a program for worker attachment. We can talk about people with disabilities as we're watching the Canadian disability benefit come in, but there are disability benefits under the CPP. But this is your base. That's how I sort of look at it. Keith.
Yeah, just building on that, one way to think about the design of retirement income systems is three pillars. One is the government pillar, there's an employment pillar, and there's an individual pillar. And Canada stacks up very well with that first pillar, the combination of OAS plus CPP. You know, it's like if you kind of annualize today in today's dollars, that gives you almost $20,000 lifetime inflation index base, but it's not enough. And then what's interesting is to distinguish in the occupational part of the system between what's happened in the public sector, where, you know, we score very well internationally as a country as to how well our public sector pensions work. And then you go over to the other side and you look at the private sector, and it's a hodgepodge. Historically, you had defined benefit plans in the corporate sector. They're closed. They're going away. Employers feel they can't bear those kinds of risks as an employer. And so they're moving to defined contribution, group RSPs, which is okay, you know, with a match, but it doesn't, for example, deal with lifetime income. And so there are all kinds of issues in the private sector part of occupational pension plans. And, you know, my recommendation to Albertans is look at that side. If you want to do something useful, you know, think about what you could do on the private sector side of occupational pension plans. I think it's a wide open area where we could do a lot better than we're currently doing. If you look at some of the other countries, for example, Australia, you know, went big early. 30 years ago, they put in, you know, a requirement for employers to offer DC plans. More recently, the UK has said for employers that don't offer a plan, you must offer something that has some minimum standards attached to it, and the employees can opt out if they want. And then in the US, you're starting state-sponsored, individual state-sponsored retirement plans for people in the states that don't have any other workplace pension plans. So you're seeing this kind of thing happening around the world. I think it's a huge opportunity for Alberta to step forward and say, what can we do as a province, on the occupational pension plan side? You know, could we create an Alberta supplementary pension plan, for example, that adds to that $20,000 a year and you know, makes 40 or 50,000 a reasonable aspiration? I mean, that's the conversation you should be having.
Yeah. And let's not forget, employers go bankrupt, right? And the pension liabilities are far down the list of who gets paid out, right? So think of Nortel, JDS Uniphase, Sears. All of these things have resulted in people losing all of that money that they've put in. And so again, the CPP adds to that base. Although, I mean, we should have more regulations around pensions in the private sector and what happens when they go belly up. But at least we have the CPP there. to aid people to ensure that they're not, 85 and working for Uber, as you see down in the United States, a lot of retirees unable to afford retirement.
Yeah, I guess, the way that I would put it is that, yes, we should make sure that these closed DB plans in the private sector, have enough funding to be able to pay. And I think the regulation has actually picked up quite a bit since Nortel in 2000. So I see that as sort of an issue that's passing, and it's going to become a less and less of an issue. And then when you look forward, the issue is, okay, what happens today for the next decade or 2 or 3 decades? Because that's how you have to think about these issues. They're multiple decade issues. They're not point in time issues. Yeah. And so I think there's an opportunity for Alberta here to do something creative.
Yeah, well, that's a really good segue to our second question. I said at the beginning of the webinar that we were going to talk about this proposal to pull out of Alberta out of CPP, and I think we've concluded and agreed that it is not a good idea, that it's reckless and irresponsible, that the costs would be high to make the transition, that it would have negative effects for individuals in terms of portability and certainty. And I really appreciate you guys describing for our audience the architecture of Canadian retirement security, and just reminding people that CPP is sort of the base foundation upon which we build further security through things like workplace pensions and individual savings. And I think that was actually the initial idea when CPP was introduced in the 60s, that we would provide retirement security in the form of like a 3-legged stool. Like there would be government supported programs like CPP, the Guaranteed Income Supplement, which is GIS, Old Age Security, OAS. Those 3 things would be the government pillar. Then there would be workplace plans. And then the third pillar would be individual savings. Just to remind our audience, I mean, that worked really well for a while, because in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, a relatively high proportion of the population did have access to workplace pensions, both in the public sector and the private sector. There were a lot of private sector pension plans, but that's changed a lot, right? Only here in Alberta, Lindsay mentioned 30% of Canadians having access to workplace pension plans. The number is actually lower here in Alberta. Only about 25% of Alberta workers pay into workplace pension plans, and as Keith said, almost all of them are in the public sector. So we have, as a labor leader, as a pension advocate, I will tell you that we have a serious problem with retirement security, and it's getting worse because, as Keith said, fewer and fewer public sector employers are providing those plans. Those that have them, every time we go to the bargaining table in the private sector, there's pressure to either dilute existing pension plans or get rid of them entirely. And for newly organized private sector workplaces, I won't say it's impossible, but it's rare for us to get a new pension plan. So that's the landscape, right? And so I want to ask both of you, like, maybe I've just outlined it myself, but how bad is it? And what are the alternatives? And in particular, I want to just put forward this notion that the New Democrats here in Alberta have put forward, right? Because it's less than 60 days now until the next provincial election, and just about a week and a half ago, the Notley New Democrats put forward a pension paper in which they made 3 commitments if they were to form government. First, they said that they would keep Alberta in CPP, so they were unequivocal about that. Second, they said that they would reform the governance of public sector pension plans, because, as I said at the outset, the UCP had stripped the ability of our big public sector pension plans to choose their investment manager. And so the UCP says you have to use the government AIMCO manager, whether you like it or not. And the teachers plan in particular didn't like that, because they were doing it on their own and doing very well. They didn't like being told who they had to hire. But so that was the second plank in the NDP pension commitment. And the third one is what we were just talking about, is they promised to expand private sector workplace pensions. And they didn't flesh it out a lot. They basically said that they would start a conversation about how this would be done. But what, in terms of the details, they did say that if they become government, they would try to, they would make available to private sector employers the tools for that are available for the public sector pension plans, notably AIMCO, the investment manager, and APS, which is Alberta Pension Services, which administers plans. So I'd be interested to hear two things from both of you. How bad is it? How big is the need in the private sector? And is the New Democrat proposal a step in the right direction, or are there other things that we should consider in terms of trying to expand that pension umbrella to cover private sector workers more effectively?
I'll have a go at say two things. One of the, I think, more underappreciated Nobel awards in economics went to an economist called George Akerlof. And his claim to fame was asymmetric information. And the whole idea is that markets work really well if buyers and sellers are working from the same information deck. But if you have asymmetric information, where, for example, the sellers know more about what they're selling than the buyers know what they're buying, you get bad outcomes. Well, I can tell you that the financial services market is a market that's rife with asymmetric information. And so that gives you an argument why it makes sense to create institutions that rectify that problem. So, that's one thing. The other thing I would say in terms of the specifics is that one of the better things that happened in pensions in Canada ever that I'm aware of, and in fact I was part of it, was the Rowan Task Force that Bob Nixon, Treasurer of Ontario in the 1980s, put together to say, I don't like it, and this is what Nixon said, I don't like the way public sector pensions are being managed in Ontario. There's got to be a better way. And the Rowan Task Force, their job was to figure out the better way. And it, in fact, did lead ultimately to the Canadian pension model, which is generally globally now considered the better way. So what I would recommend for Alberta, again, is rather than jump into something and say we know all the answers, it is in fact to create sort of a modern version of the Rowan Task Force. It took only a year and a half for the task force to talk to a lot of people, look at the theory, look at the research, and come up with some solid recommendations. And I think that would be a logical place for me to start as to how to deal with this gap that we've got in the private sector with respect to pensions.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like the recommendations from the Rowan Commission led, as you said, to the creation of what we call the Canadian model for public sector pensions, and those include joint governance of these plans between the employers and the workers, who have skin in the game, but also the creation of investment agencies like AIMCO here in Alberta, pension managers like and administrators like APS. But as a labor leader here in Alberta, what has always frustrated me is that these sort of state-of-the-art tools and mechanisms for better saving for your retirement have exclusively, almost exclusively, been with the preserve of public sector workers. And so they've created these fabulous, robust, sustainable mechanisms for helping people save for their own retirements in the public sector. But my question was, why can't we make those same kind of tools available to everyone, right? And so that's I'm encouraged by your suggestion about taking this model and sort of updating it for the 21st century and using these tools that we've created, not just for public sector workers. I'm also encouraged by the New Democrats making a commitment to look at it. If they form the government, I think I will be encouraging Premier Notley in her second term to perhaps invite you, Keith, and Lindsay to sit on a panel to make recommendations. Lindsay, what is your take on the challenge and the opportunities?
Sure, I'll just point out, I sit on a lot of panels, so that would be an interesting one. Like, I mean, how the thing that I'll say about need is just to reiterate what I was talking about in terms of senior poverty rates. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure when people get to the end of their working life as they choose, right? Because we have a lot more choices to when we retire, that there's enough income support there for them for a period of time. And I see a question in the comments that are about, you know, raising the retirement age. I think everybody's thinking about this because of France, and, you know, the protests that are going on there. Canada under Harper did raise the age to 67, but that was recently undone by Trudeau. I think we have to remember 65 is an arbitrary age set up by Bismarck. And it was set because most of us would be dead by that age, right? So we're now living longer, and we have different, you know, the more of us that get into that retirement age, we just have a different health profile and particularly cognitive profile than has occurred in the past. So whether or not it's 65 or 60 or 55 or 72, it's up to the person to make those choices, and our programs should be able to support those choices. The older you are when you retire, the higher your monthly benefits should be, because you're going to draw off of it over a shorter period of time. So, you know, that age thing doesn't have anything to do with sustainability. The CPP is sustainable. I mean, I think it's like fine until 2100 before we have to make any tweaks to contribution rates, unless we're going to change benefit levels or things like that. So, you know, the need, I think, is really tied up in understanding how do we want to live, and as a society, how do we want our seniors to live? And, you know, in terms of you know, this idea of a stool and how many different pieces you need, I do think that we do need to have a deeper conversation about this. It is harder and harder for our younger generations to afford to contribute to their own retirement, because housing is so expensive. And, you know, wages are, you know, just not quite keeping up with the cost of living. And housing is a big one. I know here in Calgary, we might not see it as much, but if you go to Vancouver or Toronto or some of these other places, like, housing is just a ginormous sinkhole for people. So we have to think about all of these different things that are happening in order to make sure that we have the suite of programs that should be available. And I entirely agree, it's a suite of programs meant for different people with different profiles. So, you know, an intersectional lens would be a really good idea in thinking about pensions in Canada.
Yeah, actually, this is probably a good opportunity to turn to some of our questions. Lindsay was responding to the first question we have from Cameron. And maybe before we turn to the second, I want to see if Keith wants to weigh in here. And Cameron is asking about retirement age, but also are increasing lifespans making these funds unsustainable? Is there truth in that notion?
Absolutely. You know, it's not very difficult to do the math on this, which is that if the period for which you have to pay out pensions you keep the age at 65, let's say, then you have to create a larger and larger and larger reserve in order to meet those obligations. If at the same time your workforce is slowing down because birth rates are down, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to make adjustments. I'm going to give a plug here to my former countrymates, the Dutch, who do some actually quite smart things every once in a while. So they have gone from 65 to 67 in a number of years. But after that, what they're doing is tying the retirement age to longevity. So they're taking it out of the political sphere, and they're basically saying, to the degree that lifespans continue to be longer, there will be an automatic adjustment to the retirement age, to the legal retirement age. And I think it's kind of a brilliant idea that gives rise to, keeping the economics fair and balanced as to how you deal with these kinds of issues. Because, the notion, I mean, I shake my head at the French, you watch even the young, are rioting in the streets. And I'm saying, well, don't you get it? You're the people that are going to have to pay, higher contribution rates for all these pensioners that keep getting their pension at age 62.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some hard math there.
I would be remiss as a labor leader if I didn't mention that just because the average life expectancy goes up doesn't mean that everyone's living longer, and it matters a lot what people do for a living in their lifetime. So in our membership, for example, we have a lot of people who do pretty tough physical labor, especially in the trades. And there's a real big difference between someone who spent their life, welding and or working in harsh conditions up in Fort McMurray. When they reach 65, their body is not in the same shape as someone who's been at a desk that whole time. And then we have firefighters who are exposed to carcinogens at work and stuff, and whose life expectancy is very much lower. So there are caveats here. So
absolutely. But my sister, I'm sure, is not listening to this. She's a teacher in Ontario. She retired at age 57. She's very healthy. I think she's going to make it to 100. So that's the other side.
Fair comment. And I'm just going to move on to a couple of the other questions we've got. Karen is asking, what impacts do you see for someone who is close to retirement? So I think she's talking about this notion about pulling Alberta out of CPP. And so for people here in Alberta who are close to retirement age, is there a higher risk for those people who are close to retirement if the UCP gets back in? In other words, if they get in, should I get out of the province? And I've got to say, I've heard a lot of this. I've heard a lot of Albertans saying, if that happens, I'm moving. I
would too, personally. Yeah, if we pull out of the CPP, that's it. But I would like to point out, because the UCP have committed to a referendum. It's not going to be in May, which means it's at least another year away. And then we have this 3-year runway between signaling and it actually being executed. You do have time, 4 to 5, possibly more years. You'll see the train coming, right? So you will be able to adjust as you see fit. So I think, it is clear that the UCP are going to keep this moving as a political football. The question is, will it ever move into a policy football? And that's the unknown. I don't know. Everybody always has these sayings. So that would be what I would say to that. Yeah.
And like I say, I've heard this over and over again. It's like, if this happens, I'm moving, right? And that honestly, that has implications for individuals, but I imagine it would have implications for the economy as well. If we're losing, especially at a time where all employers in both the public and private sector are crying labor shortage, and there are already many reasons why Albertans are leaving, especially people who work in the public sector. We've got doctors leaving, we've got nurses leaving because they feel that they've been disrespected. And now you've got this added reason for people to consider leaving the province. That would have broader economic implications, wouldn't it?
Yes.
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 In a nutshell.
In a nutshell. Okay, so we've got a question from we've got a question from Cheryl about CPP, and she's asking who manages CPP investments, because Lindsay, you just mentioned that CPP gets a much higher return than AIMCO. So who's doing those who's managing those investments? She wants to know if it's politicians.
Oh God, no.
Yes, go ahead.
So I mean, I'm sure Keith can go into way more detail than I can. It's an arm's length board. And this was reinforced by the revisions that were made in 1997, which Alberta actually was leading the charge on, to make sure that it's completely separate. It's not part of what we call the fiscal framework of the Consolidated Revenue Fund. It is off on its own, and it can't be tampered with by politicians. There's a board and everything like that. But Keith, you probably can provide the details better than I can.
Right. So this really started with Peter Drucker. So maybe he's not as well known as he used to be, because time does pass. But I think he's still generally regarded as sort of the wisest person who's ever lived on sort of
management guru.
Issues.
Yeah.
And so he wrote, out of 39 books, he wrote one book on pensions, and he wrote it in 1976. It was called The Unseen Revolution. And what he was referring to was the notion that workers would end up owning the means of production through their retirement savings, not through Marxian overthrow of capitalism. So that was sort of the play of the title. But what he said is that we really need to think, this is back now in the 70s, when the boomers are young. He said eventually they will be retired a few decades down the road, and we should really think about how we should design pension systems. And he got it down to basically two principles. One, he called, and I love the word, legitimacy. And the notion of legitimacy is you can't let some group take advantage of another group in the way that you set this thing up. It has to be legitimate, number one. And the words that come out of them is arm's length is the word. And that's, one of the pillars of the Canadian pension model, is that nobody gets to play games. It's an arm's length organization with a professional or well-seasoned board that understands this oath of integrity and legitimacy. And then the second principle was effectiveness, organizational effectiveness, is that you should have the same standard for pension organizations in terms of effectiveness as you do for any other corporation or any other not-for-profit organization. Everybody needs to aspire to be effective. And those were the two principles that got embedded in the Rowan report. And really that's the basis for the Canadian pension model. And the interesting little historical artifact is that when they set this whole thing up and teachers was sort of first in line, who would be the first board chair? You remember who the first board chair was of Ontario Teachers Pension Plan?
Before my time, Keith. So
Gerald Bowie.
Oh, from the Bank of Canada. Yeah.
Governor of the Bank of Canada.
Governor of the Bank of Canada. Yeah.
And so that was kind of a symbolic.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So when CPP created its investment board, right? Because I think Lindsay was saying
built on the same principles.
It was built on the same principles.
The CPP Investment Act,
right?
Built on those principles.
The principles of legitimacy and effectiveness. And I actually have to say that in the context of what's being proposed here in Alberta about pulling Alberta out of CPP and creating an Alberta pension plan, I would suggest that both of those principles are in question, because especially based on Danielle Smith's previous remarks that the pension money would be used as some kind of slush fund to support the oil and gas industry, as opposed to handing the money over to an arm's length investment board like we have with CPP, who makes the decisions on best returns so that they can continue paying. But if you're going to take unnecessary risks, that's the opposite of legitimacy. And then the second principle was effectiveness. And I think most Albertans would agree that the UCP, especially under Danielle Smith, has been characterized by chaos, right? Which is opposite of effectiveness, right? So I'm just going to go to another couple of questions because we are drawing towards the end of our time together. Jorge has a question. This goes back to the comment you made earlier in the webinar, Lindsay, about the political motivation of this. So Jorge is asking, what really is the motivation to pull out of CPP by the UCP? What is the end goal? Is it a foot in the door for separation? And is there something that we don't know that they are promoting this despite it being very dangerous for Albertans? So what, is this all politics? And honestly, in any other province, we wouldn't use this word, but in Alberta, is this about laying the groundwork for separation?
That one I don't know about. I mean, I honestly don't know about. But we can't, this came from the firewall letter. It is nothing more than political football. I mean, I've lived in almost every province in Canada, and I've never heard this debate of pulling out of the CPP, right? Nobody in BC talks about it. Nobody in Ontario talks about it. It's just granted. So it is, in essence, a political issue. What their long-term goal is, I think it's just to try to stick it to Ottawa, but in the end, they stick it to workers.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, and that's as a worker representative and a pension advocate, that in a nutshell is our concern. They're playing political games with other people's retirement savings. They're trying to stick it to Ottawa, but everyone else is going to pay the price, right? We've got another question from Robert here, and he's asking if the Alberta pension plan goes ahead, are the liabilities assumed to be greater or less than or equal to the value of the assets? And that
we don't know, because we don't know the plan. Yeah.
It's all up in the air.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems, right? I mean, because and actually this leads to an issue that we haven't raised so far in this webinar, and that's the UCP's own report that that purports to justify this idea of pulling Alberta out of CPP. They say that they've done a study that proves that it makes sense, but they haven't released it, right?
It proves it makes sense under very specific assumptions that one move, like even a 1 point move, one way or another in any of the variables, and it's a house of cards, right? So you have to be very, very careful and make sure. And I know when that report comes out that all eyes are going to be on it. And Trevor will have a graph, I'm sure.
That's Trevor Thome. He's another one of our famous Alberta economists who's famous for his slide decks. So,
yeah, and he doesn't have kids. So like he just, he spends his mornings in his basement creating graphs, right? I love Trevor. So there's just no way to say, unless they come out with what we would see like in federal budgets and things like this, an entire sensitivity analysis, how it is, what assumptions here and there. But I actually don't think we'll see that, because when they put out the report, I assume it's to begin the process for a referendum. So they're going to want to stack the deck.
Yeah, exactly. So we're drawing near the end of our time together. So I want to start moving towards a conclusion, and maybe I want to give each of you an opportunity to have a final word on the two big questions, right? So the first was, should we pull out of CPP? Does that make any sense? And the second is, what else should we be looking at? So maybe if, I'll give each of you an opportunity to give your final word on the first question, which is this notion of pulling Alberta out of CPP.
I'll just say it's not a good idea. So that's me. I'm done.
Yes. Yeah.
Don't do it.
Keith?
Well, I think that there's sort of a poetic license in pulling the two ideas together. There is an issue around pensions, not just in Alberta, but a lot of other places. And why not take this discussion you're having about pensions from a negative conversation to a positive conversation, and think about some Alberta supplementary pension plan that creates that extra $20,000 a year that people need, and not to jig around with the first 20,000. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, that's one of the I was very encouraged by the paper put up by the New Democrats, that they didn't outline a specific solution, but they said that we should start the conversation about creating a supplemental pension plan that would not replace CPP, but it would be on top of it, right? And that's exactly what you're talking about, right, Keith? Yeah. So where do we go from here, do you think? And what would your advice be to an incoming government after our next election, which at this point is less than 60 days away?
We've got to stop creating all this policy uncertainty. For all the UCP talk about that they're all for economic growth and what have you, boy, they really do like policy volatility, which really eats away at any kind of economic growth and business growth and all of that kind of stuff. Uncertainty is not good. Policy uncertainty is, look at Quebec and the whole separation referendums that they went through for 20 years and the massive impact that had on their economy as well. So, I would just stop. There's nothing here. Stop fueling the flames. Stop thinking of this as a political issue. This isn't your money. It's ours.
Yeah.
And, I would say that as sort of literally the outsider looking in here is, this whole global net zero movement is not a fantasy. It's happening. And there is going to be a significant global transition away from fossil fuels towards other energy sources over the course of the next 25 years. It's baked into the reality. And so if you're going to do sort of an underlying assumption as to how you need to think about the next 25 years in Alberta, you have to take that as one of the realities.
Yeah. And so this notion of taking our retirement savings and investing it, trying to prop up an industry that's in the midst of a transition it's a highly risky proposition. Highly risky proposition. But that goes to Lindsay's point that it's not their money. They should not be gambling with it. Right?
Correct.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly answer Marshall's question. OAS, you get a letter from Services Canada the month you turn 64, and the month after you turn 65 is the day your OAS benefits start flowing. And, just to put a shout out, the Government of Canada has a Canadian Retirement Income Calculator. It is excellent because it actually incorporates all of these programs, GIS, OAS, CPP, your employment pensions, all of this kind of stuff. And you can actually track. I do this every year, look to see where you are and make informed choices as you go along. I highly recommend it.
Well, talking about informed choices, that I think that's a good place for us to end. As I mentioned, maybe several times during the course of this webinar, we are less than 60 days away from a provincial election. And I really think that the conversation that we had today will help a lot of voters be more informed as they go to the ballot box, because, like it or not, the question of our retirement security, the future of CPP in Alberta, those are on the ballot right now. And so if you're concerned about your pensions, if you're concerned about retirement security, I think that you've got a lot of information from both Lindsay and Ted and Keith today that will help you make a good decision at the ballot box. If as for a lot of Albertans, I think this is one of their big issues. So on behalf of the Federation of Labor, I really want to thank both Professor Teds and Keith for joining us today for this important conversation. If you liked this webinar, we are going to be putting it up on YouTube, and so within the next day or so. And so if you liked it, I would like it to encourage everyone who joined us today to share it with their friends. We'll be sharing it with our networks. But that brings us to the end of our time today. Thank you very much, Keith, Lindsay, for a fabulous discussion. And thanks especially to everyone who's joined us today for this webinar. And finally, I just want to give a shout out to our staff at the AFL who've helped pull this together and present it for you today. So especially thanks to Beth and MC from our staff. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you at the polls in less than 60 days. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.